Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Museum at Home. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Shauna, and I am very excited. Our pop-up talk today is called Frogs and Toads Living on the Edge. And I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, Dr. Randy Mooi, who's been a zoologist at the Manitoba Museum for 16 years. So Randy, if you're there, you can join us.
Hi,
Hi,
Shauna.
Randy.
How
How
are
are
you doing?
you? I was going to ask the same thing. I am very excited because not only do I love frogs and toads, but also I'm pretty excited that you might share some of the research that happens here at the Manitoba Museum. Sometimes when visitors come to visit us, they may not realize how much research goes on behind the scenes in the lab, but also out in the field.
Well, it's always a great day to talk about frogs and toads. People may have heard them a little more often this year because it's been quite a wet spring and summer. And so they may even heard them in their own backyards or in nearby ditches. And right now, the tadpoles are transforming. They're metamorphosing from their tadpole shape to little froglets and toadlets. So they're hopping around all over the place now. So if people are out in the woods or near marshes, they're very likely to run across them.
Yes, it is summertime and it's very exciting to see any types of frogs or tadpoles out at the lake. I'm very excited. So Randy's going to give a short presentation. Those of us joining today on Zoom, if you have any questions for Randy at all during the presentation, you're welcome to put them into the chat. And on Facebook, you can put your questions into the comments and we'll have time for question and answer at the end. So we'll be relaying those questions to Randy. So over to you, Randy.
All right, well, we'll just share a screen here for a second. I'm going to share some computer sound. And we'll get, so we're going to be talking about frogs and toads on the edge today. And frogs and toads do live on the edge of all sorts of things, between land and water. They're at the edge of the ranges here in Manitoba. This is for many of them, this is as far north as they get. And as well, they are on the edge of some of the problems with environmental issues and those sorts of things. So we'll look at what the museum is looking at for some of those in some of those areas. But we'll also, before we do that, we'll take a little tour of frogs and toads in Manitoba. Manitoba is a great place to get to know frogs and toads because in North America, there's quite a diversity, maybe about 100 species or so. But here in Manitoba, there's just about 12. So we have 4 different tree frogs. We have the spring peeper. This is a little fellow, boreal chorus frog, very common frog. 2 kinds of tree frogs, a gray tree frog and Cope's tree frog. I just have the one picture because they're both very similar to each other. You can only tell them apart from their calls.
Hey Randy, sorry to interrupt you. I don't see your screen share. Maybe it's just me.
Oh dear. Okay, let's see what's going on here. Why not? I didn't share. There we go. Is that better?
There we go. Now we've got it. Awesome.
We got it? All right. All right. Sorry, everyone. We'll start that again. So we have frogs and toads on the edge. And you know, frogs and toads live on the edge of water and land. They're also at the edge of their range here, sometimes reaching just the northern part of their range. And they're also on the edge as far as danger to their environment. Some of them are quite limited that way. So we're going to look at what the museum does to study some of these animals here in the province. But before we do that, I thought we'd do a little tour of the kinds of toads and frogs that we've got. So we have, in all of North America, there's probably about 100 species of toads and frogs. So Manitoba is a great place to know frogs and toads because we just have about 12 species. So we have tree frogs, just 4 of those, spring peepers, boreal chorus frog, and gray and Cope's tree frog. These are both exactly the same looking. You can only tell them apart by their call. We have true frogs, 4 of those, wood frogs, leopard frogs that many people are familiar with, and then 2 frogs that just barely make it into the east side of the province. green frogs, and mink frogs, which again look very similar to each other. For toads, we have 3 species of toads: Canadian toad, American toad, and Great Plains toad. And we have what's called a spadefoot, sometimes called a spadefoot toad. So these are all the species that occur in Manitoba. Now they all have different calls, and so you don't only have to see frogs and toads to figure out that they're around, you can hear them, of course. So we're not going to listen to every species because we don't have time today, but I'll just give you a quick survey of a few of the funny different sounds. We don't have the classic sort of ribbit call that people are used to hearing on cartoons or in the movies. The green frog is a really great call. It sounds a bit like a banjo being plucked. So that's a great little call there. And wood frogs come in 2 different color forms. They have one that has a stripe down the back and another that doesn't. They all have the mask that's very typical. These are some of the earliest calling frogs in Manitoba, usually even into early April. And from a distance, they sound a little bit like a duck quacking from a distance. And the boreal chorus frog is probably the commonest frog in the province. I've done a little sort of back of the envelope calculation one time, and by the end of the summer, when the tadpoles have all turned into froglets, there may be as many as 5 billion of these in the province. They come in many different colors. They can be bright green with spots, with stripes, or sort of a mix of green and brown like this. And they have a really what should be a familiar call because you can hear them in ditches, along roadways, all through the province. Sounds a bit like a thumb running along the back of a comb. So that's a boreal chorus frog. Toads have a few different sounds. The American toad, you'll hear the chorus frogs in the background of this one, but they have a long trill, which is very characteristic. The plain spadefoot toad has a call that is about as close to the sort of classic ribbit call that we have in the province. And then again, you'll probably hear some chorus frogs in the background of this recording, and then this spadefoot toad. So that's just a few of those calls. And of course, toads are calling in an attempt to find mates. So they only call in the spring, or most of these toads only call, or most of these frogs and toads call only in the spring. So they get mates and then they lay eggs, of course. So they're usually, the adults are mostly terrestrial, so they live on land, but they have to go into the water to lay their eggs. The eggs hatch into these little tadpoles, and after several weeks, these will become little toadlets or froglets and hop back onto land and be mostly terrestrial again. You can even tell what species of frogs and toads are around by the kinds of eggs that you might find in the ponds. So you've got these long strings for toads, so that's a sure sign that you have toads nearby. Wood frogs, that early caller that I mentioned before, they lay these big clusters of eggs, maybe 500 to 1,000 eggs in a cluster, and then all the females lay them all together. So if you look into ponds and you see these big clusters of eggs, that means you've got wood frogs around. Boreal chorus frogs, they're tiny little fellows, and the female frogs lay, maybe 200 eggs total in the spring, but in these small little clusters. Here you can see a toonie, $2 coin right here, and the tiny little eggs, and some of them are just starting to hatch into little tadpoles. So a lot of our frogs and toads, as I mentioned, live in temporary ponds So they're laying their eggs in these bodies of water that don't last very long. So they have to get through those eggs and larval stages really quickly. But they like these spots because there are no fish in them. So no fish can live in these, and so their eggs and tadpoles are safer. So this is a pond that has a couple of species. I'll just let you hear how loud some of these ponds can be in the spring when all of these toads and frogs are gathering together. So you can get quite an idea that there's a lot of toads and frogs around, even though we don't see them that often. So frogs and toads are also on the edge because they have to get through the winters. And they have several different ways that they can get through these kinds of climate changes. Tree frogs, these four species here, the peeper, the boreal chorus frog, gray tree frog, and Cope's gray tree frog, as well as the wood frog, in the fall, they start to produce special chemicals that act like antifreeze. So they can actually freeze solid. So they just go under a little bit of dirt or some leaves near the surface and just freeze solid and survive the winter that way. Most of the other true frogs, things like leopard frogs, green frogs, and mink frogs, they hibernate under the water as long as the water has enough oxygen in it and it doesn't freeze all the way to the bottom. So they have to have fairly deep ponds. Toads and spadefoots, they also have to get below the frost line. They don't go into the water though, they dig into the sand or loose dirt. And they do that by digging backwards with their strong feet here. The spadefoot toad is so called because it has a big sort of claw on the back that helps it dig into the dirt. So that's how they get through the winter. Now, if you think winters are tough now for toads and frogs, just think what they were, maybe 18,000 to 10,000 years ago when the entire province and most of Canada actually was completely covered in ice. So these glaciers, during the glacial period, we had maybe 1 kilometer to 2 kilometers of ice that just completely scraped Manitoba clean of most of its plants and animals. And then finally, these started to melt, obviously, because we're here now. So the ice sheets would gradually melt about 9,000 years ago. They started moving backwards. We had these strange mixes of different kinds of habitats, but frogs and toads and other animals and plants started to move back in. We start to get to things that we sort of start recognize, boreal forest, prairie, until we get to the kind of habitats that we have today. So our frogs and toads now, different ones use these different habitats in different ways. So there's, with all these changes, there's some basic questions for Manitoba fauna, for the frogs and toads that actually live in the province. So these are the questions that I've been looking at in my research. So are these, really the range limit? So when we look in a book, like Amphibians and Reptiles of Manitoba that was written in the 1980s, this nice range that they show here with the dots for a species like gray tree frog, is this really where they occur? Or is it just because we haven't gone to look for them in other parts of the province? And how did it get here? Remember that we were scraped clean by the glaciers. So did they come from the west, or did they come from the east or the south? How did they get back into the province? And then what is happening in Manitoba with these populations now? How is maybe climate change changing their distributions, or how they're living, or what people are doing in general? There's two basic kinds of distributions of frogs and toads in Manitoba. So we either have ones that just barely make it in, like the plain spadefoot toad, very restricted distribution, or we might have something like the wood frog that, remember, this is the one that can freeze solid, so they managed to get all the way up to Hudson Bay, so basically all the way through the province, wherever we've looked for them. And then there are some models about how these animals have gotten here. Some people have studied the spring peeper. So the suggestion is that these animals have moved around, sort of come through Ontario, and then gotten into Manitoba that way. But whenever you look at these studies, you find out that they don't have any data, any specimens from Manitoba. So this is one of the things that I was trying to rectify with some of my research. So can we look for these kinds of frogs? Can we see these things happening? So I've been very fortunate to get to a lot of places in Manitoba that few Manitobans have seen, because I try to go to some remote spots. So we might use a float plane to get to some areas, like islands in the middle of Lake Winnipeg, Big Sandy Island, Little George Island, or George Island. And initially I was going there to survey fishes. But when we got there, it turned out that the frogs and toads were actually at least as interesting. One of the species that we found was a kind of toad. So before we go to these places, scientists like to have an idea, a hypothesis. What sorts of things might be around that in these islands? And if you look at the ranges of Canadian toad here and American toad here, you can see that they don't tell you what's happening in Lake Winnipeg. So we can maybe come up with a guess looking at some of the geological history. Remember, when the glaciers left, Lake Winnipeg didn't look like it does today. This is basically Lake Winnipeg about 7,000 years ago. And you can see that the islands that I went to visit are the tops of hills on this peninsula that's right in here. So this is Lake Winnipeg today, with sort of the islands that I went to in these colors, a lot bigger than they really are in real life, with this peninsula here. So given that this is joined onto the east side, the east shore, we would think that there would be American toads. Now, as it turns out, there were Canadian toads there. So we want to find out why they might be there. The other thing that when you look at these ranges of Canadian American toads is that there's nothing on these maps that shows what species is where these black arrows are. So that's another thing that I wanted to do, get to some remote areas and see actually what species are occurring there. We know what is happening in the south here pretty well. There's been a lot of studies along the Trans-Canada Highway, about right in between Kenora in this direction and Winnipeg in this direction, looking at what's called a hybrid zone between American and Canadian toads. And we know American people are south of Manitoba and Canadian people are north. But for American toads and Canadian toads, the zone or the boundary is runs north and south like this. And this has moved back and forth over different times. And so there's been a lot of studies, so we know what's happening there. But we don't know what's happening in the north. And so that's was some of my research. So driving up there, trying to get to some remote spots, you end up putting in some pretty long days, looking for spots that you might find toads during the day. And unfortunately, for me anyway, toads don't start calling until it's dark. And in the spring, it stays light for a very long time, till about 10 o'clock or so. So I'm not able to listen for these guys calling for their females until starting about 10 o'clock at night. So I would work until maybe 4 in the morning, get these big trucks driving by, looking in ditches and some of these ponds and seeing what species were actually there by taking measurements, doing this sort of thing back in a sort of a makeshift lab. And what I found was it looks like there's a hybrid zone through the north that runs along this green line here. So these are all the spots that I was surveying for toads and frogs. And this is sort of where it looks like there's a hybrid zone. Now you'll notice here, I'm not finding very many toads at all. And this is a place that I call the toadless desert. And this is what it looks like. Remember that toads in the winter, they have to have loose soil to be able to dig underneath to avoid freezing in the winter time. And this is a burn area, but you can see how close the rocks are in these areas. So the toads just have no place to burrow in this sort of raised, dry area here. So that's the toadless desert. I was also looking at spring peepers. Remember we were talking about, do these animals actually occur where the books say they are, or do they live somewhere else? These are really cute little frogs. This is a pencil here on my desk with a toad sitting on it. Here they are in the wild, getting ready to call. We'll just listen to them for a second, but you can see that I've stretched the distribution of these a little bit to the west, almost into Saskatchewan. So these are all new locations. So that's a species that you might hear if you have a cottage down in the Whiteshell area, or maybe in Kenora, or if you travel up towards Snow Lake or Flin Flon. I was also finding them in a brand new area here. This is all new territory. Hecla Island, and then further west of that, in these little small ditches and things. They don't occur any further south than there because of the change in the habitat. So we change from essentially boreal forest to these just island areas. And you can see how much there's just these isolated little patches of woods, and they're just not big enough to hold populations of peepers. So here's me, a very rare photo of me in the field catching some spring peepers. This is early in the spring, probably about 2 degrees Celsius or so, hence all the winter gear. And I've successfully caught a couple of spring peepers that were calling in this pond in a brand new spot that no one knew where they were before. So getting samples of DNA, this looks like a very complicated diagram, but basically what we have here, you remember this earlier map where we were looking at how spring peepers may have gotten to Manitoba. Well, now we actually have some specimens of spring peepers from Manitoba, so we can compare their DNA with all other different areas. And so this is like a family tree of spring peepers in North America. And what you see here, Manitoba slots right in this spot here. Looks like it's most closely related to Michigan, Illinois, and Iowa spring peepers. So in this orange circle right here. So we're starting to get an idea of maybe where our spring peepers came from. So nothing stays the same. So we had mentioned that, of course, we had glaciation before, and we've gotten to what we think of as normal over here. But that's going to change in the future as well, and probably change a lot faster than it might have if people hadn't been influencing the climate so much, the environment. So this is for old guys like me. This is basically how we think of Canadian climate. So this is the number of days during the year that we have over 30 degrees Celsius. So a nice hot sort of summer day. So you can see in most of the prairies, this is the hottest spot, and there's maybe 20, maybe 25 days of 30 degrees or more during the year. This is what it's predicted to look like about 30 years from now. So you can see it's just, we'll just go back there for a second. So this is what it looks like basically now, and this is what it's predicted to look like. It almost looks like we're on fire. So if we look at Manitoba a little more closely, so we've got about, maybe 15 to 20 days of 30-degree weather. And in 30 years, we've got 50 or more days of 30-degree weather. So this is going to affect our frogs and toads quite a bit. And we're already seeing the effects of climate change. This is a species, this is a gray tree frog here, even though he's green, they can change color depending on their habitat. We know these really well. This is around Grand Rapids in the northern Interlake. This is Long Point here. This is the road to the Paw, and this is Grand Rapids right here. When I first started working at the museum, this is as far north as we ever found them. This little triangle here. A couple of years later, we were finding them here. We thought, well, you know, maybe they're just getting as far as the North Saskatchewan River, which runs through here, and they aren't any further than that. A couple of years later, we found them across the North Saskatchewan River, and now we found them as far north as here. So they've moved over 20 kilometers north in just the few years that I've been studying frogs in this area. So we know that climate change does seem to be affecting these species. So with these changes, these super high temperatures, there are other things that are going to change as well. Remember when we had these prairie frogs like Great Plains toad and plains spadefoot in these temporary ponds that are in the middle of fields. Well, if it gets super hot, they're going to dry up really quickly, and these animals won't have enough time to lay their eggs, have them grow into tadpoles, and then become adults again. So they're going to be in a lot of trouble. We also don't know what might happen to the toads we were looking at that lived on these islands. If we don't know exactly what's going to happen with water levels, but if they go up, these islands will disappear. If they go down, then these islands will once more join the mainland, and that'll change the ecology completely. So we've looked at a few of the things that the museum is studying. So are these really the range limits? Well, frequently when you look in books that have been published, no, they may not be. People may just not have looked for these animals in certain places. So, you know, when you're at your cottage, it's a good idea to listen and try to figure out what's around. Maybe you'll find some new records of some of these species. So here's the spring peeper, where I've been finding them in this area and this area, and this is all new in the last 10 years or so. And then how did it get here? We had looked at spring peepers as well, so we're starting to get a bit of an idea. Our animals seem to be related to Michigan and Iowa and Illinois here. And then what's happening with these Manitoba populations? Well, it appears that at least for gray tree frog, that with climate change, they're moving northward very slowly. So they're getting to these areas north of where they used to occur in the province. And there'll probably be lots of other changes too. So with all these three different questions, the animals that are worried most about what the answers are these guys. They'd really like to know what the answers to those questions are. Thanks very much. You need to turn your mic on, Shauna.
Thank you. I was just saying thank you very much for sharing about frogs and toads. And also we just had a comment in our chat box that someone really loves frogs and toads, and I said we do too. It's very clear that we do. And it was also great to learn about some of the research, especially with all the things that are changing with our climate and how that's affecting their range limits. That's really important research. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Yeah,
we do have some questions from our viewers today. So I'm going to ask one from Desiree, actually. She wants to know, are there any poisonous frogs in my backyard I should worry about? I live in Winnipeg.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, there's no poison.
No, absolutely not. There are some very famous frogs from South America, the so-called poison dart frogs, that are very, very toxic. And if you touch them and you know, lick your fingers or whatever, they can be deadly. No, none of our frogs and toads are in that sort of category. That doesn't mean I would recommend picking up frogs and licking them, but our toads do have some toxins that they produce, and so you do have to, if you go out and catch a toad, make sure you wash your hands very well before you rub your eyes or eat anything, things like that. So they do produce some of these toxins to try to keep predators from eating them, but there isn't really anything that's going to do you any long-term harm.
Right. So you don't need to worry, Desiree, about poisonous frogs in your backyard. We have another question. This one's from Facebook. Our viewer says, I was at Hecla last week and I saw a frog on a path that was gray and only about an inch big. What might it have been? I know it's kind of hard without a photograph, but...
Right. It can be tough. This time of year, there are a lot of froglets and toadlets hopping around. So when they're very tiny, they might be this year's frogs and toads that have just metamorphosed from tadpoles. If it's gray, that probably rules out some species, but the chances are that it would be likely a chorus frog. If it's gray, they're very variable in coloration, so they might look gray hopping around, but yeah, it's pretty hard. But if you have a picture of it, feel free to send it to me and by email, and I'll take a look and I'll see if I can let you know what it is.
That's great. Thanks, Randy. And you mentioned the chorus frogs too were one of the more abundant frogs in Manitoba as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, we have another one from Stefan, and he was saying, I guess he was camping, and when he was packing up his campsite, he noticed there were 2 toads out between the tarp and the bottom of a tent. And is there a certain type of toad in the white shell area? So a common toad?
In the white shell, that's almost certainly to be an American toad. They can be a little tricky to identify, even when you have them in the hand and have a comparison with Canadian toads. But in that area, it's almost certainly to be an American toad. And they're probably going to your tent because you probably had insects caught under there, and they're probably finding some food there.
Awesome. I have an interesting question here. Kathy is asking, is it worthwhile to put a toad house in my backyard? I live in Riverview, so that's in the South Osborne area here in Winnipeg. It's about 8 blocks from the river.
I think it's worth a try. There certainly will be toads in parts of the city. Whether or not they would be in that neighborhood, it's a little tricky to say. If you live in a place where there are toads around, one thing that is worth mentioning perhaps is that if you have window wells, toads do fall into those and then can't get out again. So sometimes it's a nice thing to do to put a little board that sort of runs at an angle that runs to the bottom of your window well up back onto the so they can hop their way out again if they fall in.
Cool tip.
But you can certainly try to do that and see what happens. It doesn't hurt.
Mm-hmm. I have a general question. I think that's more related to your the research that you're doing from Facebook. What are some pros and cons of frogs moving north for the frogs and for other species?
Well, I mean, for some of these frogs, they're expanding their ranges, so that's certainly a plus for them, and that's certainly been happening for a very long time. As I mentioned, we were covered in glaciers, so frogs and toads and lots of other animals have expanded their ranges for thousands of years. So this is just a little bit further. For other species, clearly, if some species are moving in, that likely means conditions are changing for those other ones. Most of our frogs and toads live quite happily together in the same places. They call at different times, so they have they use ponds at different times. So it probably wouldn't affect other amphibian species that much.
Yeah, and sometimes it's hard to know what the effects are going to be until they almost happen, right, in the ecosystem.
Unfortunately, that's the way it goes.
Yeah.
And these are, yeah, these are things that are just happening on their own accord. It's not like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think when that happens, people are really doing a great deal of harm directly that way.
Mm-hmm. I have it's summertime. I have a question from someone who loves to look for toads, and it's, can handling toads give you warts on your fingers?
No, they cannot. As I mentioned, you do have to watch out for their poison glands. They have a couple of very large sort of porous bumps just behind their eyes, and those do produce sort of a mucousy venom. So if you handle them a lot and disturb them when you're holding them, they might produce some of that that toxin. So you do have to make sure you wash your hands well. They're likely to pee on you as well, so it's probably don't really need to tell people to wash their hands after.
Yeah, we're all getting pretty good at washing our hands anyways lately, aren't we?
That's true.
We're in
That's
good practice. I have Caleb on Facebook. He says he looks for frogs and toads all the time, and he's wondering why he can't find them. So can you give us some tips for this?
Yeah, they are pretty hard to find when they're not calling. They're very cryptic, so they have you saw all the different color types that I was showing you. All those colors really help them hide very, very well. And so I wouldn't despair. Don't be too sad about not finding frogs and toads when they're not calling. I have a lot of trouble doing that too. So even the professionals have trouble finding them, but keep trying. I know even when I'm my son was just mowing the lawn, thankfully, the other day, and he found a couple of frogs on the property when he was cutting the grass. So keep your eyes open, and this is a really good time of year to be looking for frogs and toads again, because a lot of the kids, a lot of the froglets and toadlets are just coming out of the ponds. The best place to look is around pond edges. So really look for frogs and toads in those areas.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. That looks like most of our questions, all of our questions are answered today. First of all, I'd like to thank you so much, Randy, for joining us today and sharing your research, but also about frogs and toads. And I'd also like to thank our viewers today for joining us. I'm glad to see there's lots of other frog lovers around.
Yeah, it's great. It's really great. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Yes.
And yeah, maybe we'll chat soon. Feel free to send questions to me if you have any more. I'll be happy to try to answer them.
That's awesome, Randy. So we'll connect anyone with that. And I also wanted to mention some visitors were asking recently, or our viewers, that we're happy to offer these virtual pop-up talks, of course, free of charge. But some people have asked if they can donate to support more talks like this one. And the answer is yes. As a not-for-profit organization, we gratefully accept donations of all sizes. So if you'd like to donate, that's awesome. You can visit manitobamuseum.ca and click on the donate button on the bottom right-hand side of the screen to donate online. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.